Welcome to the Inside Digital Transformation Podcast. Inside Digital Transformation explores how organizations of every size and shape are using technology today to survive and thrive in the face of relentless change. If you are a business or technology leader charged with making the most of digital transformation in your organization, then this podcast is for you. And now here's your host, Alan Bernard, a technology journalist, editor, and copywriter who has been covering the intersection of business and technology for over 2 decades.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I'll be talking with Brian Shea on how you can use a scorecard he developed to better manage cybersecurity at your organization. Even if you are starting from zero or have a fully staffed security operations center, the scorecard is a great tool for getting a handle on the risks you face, how well you are managing them, and where you need to do better. Brian is currently the CIO of MedOne Healthcare Partners, a patient services, hospital staffing, and consulting company in Columbus, Ohio. Hi, Brian. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Alan. Again, happy to be here.
So, Brian, I want to start the episode off today by asking you your definition of digital transformation. You know, it can mean so many different things to so many different people depending on the industry that they're in, their IT maturity level, where they're at on their digital transformation journey. So how do you define digital transformation?
To me, it's continual process improvement, right? I think you hear a lot of people that they start a digital transformation kind of journey or project, and they may even bring in a CTO, which in the past used to be called like a chief technology officer, and now that term has really been used for chief transformation officer. But I think the big thing is, it's how do you align, how are you looking at continual risk mitigation? How are you changing the way you operate? How are you bringing just a different look and view all the time, right, to your kind of digital world, I guess, right? So, looking at how do you improve efficiencies, how you provide value, it could be value to your internal folks or to customers, but how do you bring technology in to operate more efficiently and effectively?
Okay. I have a definition that I've been running by people just to get feedback on it, and I want to see what you think. I think of digital transformation as kind of a single sentence, and that is using digital technologies to change the status quo. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good definition, right? Of it. I think that's broad, right? Again, depending on where you go and what direction you're talking about with change, right, and transformation, right? What are you trying to change, right? Within your organization, are you trying to change how you operate, or are you trying to change, again, in the sense with security, it could be how you operate, but how do you operate in a secure manner, right? With transformation, it could also mean of just the change of how things have occurred, right? We've all had to transform, right? When
Sure.
COVID hit,
Absolutely.
right? So we all went through a digital transformation in a way, right? So we immediately had remote workforce, more broad, right? Not necessarily new, but definitely, more prevalent for everybody having to work in that. So we all had to transform, right? So then that also changed the transformation of not how only do you operate, but also how do you secure those people, right? So there's a lot of different levels of transformation when you talk about it. But I think your definition is good from the broad sense of it is what we're trying to do.
Right. Well, and today there's no organization, I would say almost anywhere, worldwide, that isn't impacted by digital technologies. Right? You think of FinServe, even FinServe apps in like sub-Saharan Africa, for example. They actually use SIM cards on their phones as currency in those regions, right? And things like that, where if you move up, obviously into North America and, more advanced, countries from a technology perspective, obviously, can you think of a single organization today that actually could function effectively without digital technology?
Probably not well.
Right?
Yes, that's I can't imagine. I think you could talk about how technology impacts at all levels, right, in some form or fashion, right? It's probably, it'd be very difficult for me to say, here's an organization or an industry or a company that can completely operate without any technology intervention, either them as a
Right.
consumer or a user, or or
Exactly. Right.
leveraging it, in some way. So, I find that hard to believe in today's world that would exist.
It's amazing. I mean, I know for a couple hours, right? If you go down, I heard the story about Maersk when they got hit with the NotPetya virus.
Mm-hmm.
They lost everything. They had one DNS server in Africa somewhere. They had to go. That they rebuilt their network using that server.
And I've been in healthcare a long time, right? And I think about it as, even over this past year, we had, there's power outages and things like that, right? Where organizations go offline but even if you think more global, some of those health systems that were impacted by ransomware, for, days, on
Yeah.
end,
Yeah.
where
Mm-hmm.
people have gone from, before the electronic medical record, everything was paper chart, right? There is still some organizations that still do things on paper, but it's pretty rare, right? So having to jump back and operate in a way that you've just become so, ingrained in leveraging the technology and how you operate and
Exactly.
communicate. And then even in you think about healthcare, even the devices, forget about the medical record, the devices they're using to monitor patients, right? Life safety systems,
Mm-hmm.
those kind of things, those all rely on technology, in some ways. So going back to a device that has no technology involved in it to provide healthcare, right? I mean, that's,
Mm-hmm.
that's going back,
Sure.
quite a way. So, and that's scary, right? How would you work, in that way? And just healthcare is one piece of it. But if you think of, you make a widget, right? You're an auto
Mm-hmm.
manufacturer, and your plant goes down because the technology that you're using, you shut down, right? At that point in time and come to a screeching halt.
I agree completely. I think it's a nice segue actually into the cyber conversation now, because I mean that is the impact of cyber, especially ransomware. I mean, it's my understanding that a lot of hospitals have been hit over the last couple of years, and they're paying, but they're not talking about it, right? And then not to
Mm-hmm.
impugn their motives. I mean, they got to, you can't have an ER shut down, right? And so they have to do what they have to do in the moment, right, to get their systems up and running again.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, obviously, that raises the importance of cybersecurity to a whole new level over what it was even 5 years, 7, 8 years
Yeah.
ago, right? And so let's bring that around to, can you address the importance of cybersecurity today? And I know it sounds like kind of a leading basic question, right? But it seems to me that there's a lot of organizations today that still struggle with defining why it's important that they invest in something that has no KPIs associated with it, right? You can't measure a negative.
Yeah, so security has evolved a lot, right? With the risk, I think over time, especially, the introduction of ransomware, right? As a big game changer, of course, from a security perspective. There's always been, I don't want to say always, there's always been bad guys, right? There's, and the intent has always typically been, early on, I think it was more so to cause disruption, right? Then it's to cause disruption and then financial gain tied together. The financial gain piece, it really took off, right? Of course, with ransomware, and you tie that with, cryptocurrency, and you put those together, as both those technologies, well, not necessarily technologies, but as cryptocurrency took off, the ability for the ransomware to occur, uh, just made it a lot easier, right? The traceability, the ability to hide themselves, and a lot easier, and ease of payment and things like that to occur, and then people start paying it, right? So it's that has been probably the biggest game changer, I would say, and then layering in, I think, even just the whole social media aspect, right? Over the past many years, just the ability in all these apps and how we communicate, and the readily available avenues that you could be communicated with, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you layer that on, the bad guys have just a lot more avenues, right, to come at you, right? Than you go back earlier in my IT career, you may be worried about an email with a virus attachment, on it, or something like that, someone bringing in, a file that, was infected, from home because they
Or
got
a thumb
something.
drive, right?
Right. So it's
Yeah.
the whole footprint has become greater, right? I think for us. And then you think cloud and all the SaaS solutions and things like that. Um, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of applications now versus you go back earlier, you had a handful of key applications, right, that you had to worry about, and a few attack vectors that you maybe had. Now, it's kind of almost endless.
How do you raise the level of importance of the conversation, right? Because today it's my understanding that at companies that get it, it's a boardroom discussion. And you and I have had this conversation before, right? Where you're reporting to the board. That's not an unusual situation today, right? At companies that understand cyber. But I think that it's still, relatively new where the board is actually getting involved at that level, at the operational level of cyber, right? And asking, what are you doing as an organization, or what are we doing as an organization? Am I right
Yes.
in that?
Yeah, you are. I think there's a lot of different, again, ways to answer that. I think, part of it is some organizations, they find it easier when they're given criteria, like a requirement to meet, right? So you have some organizations, and when I say that, you're talking, like maybe cyber liability insurance, right? To get cyber liability insurance, you have to check certain box and make sure you're doing certain things. So those make those things tangible. Yeah, so if you're an organization that has certain compliance requirements to meet, let it be HIPAA or PCI or SOX or whatever it is, they're more tangible, like I said, to take to a board or take to the leadership and say, to get this or to have this, we must do this, right? So those check boxes usually are easier to get put in place. What I have found, though, too, is make it real, right? I mean, I think you have another avenue where you've been impacted as an organization potentially, right? So it became really real to you, right? That
Mm-hmm.
this occurred and now you have the buy-in from leadership to make a change, right? Because of a bad thing occurred, right? Or it hits close to home, right? Maybe there's a partner or maybe there's another, company that's, does what you do, right? A competitor even, right? And they were hit in a certain way, right? So that, that makes it real a little bit with it. But
So I guess what you're saying is it needs, in order to affect, right, the way that the organization thinks about cyber, you have to make it real. It has to be a tangible threat, not some, thing off in the future that maybe if we might get hit and then we might be a headline, and it has to be something that if we don't, then this may, right?
I think that makes it easier in that conversation, right? You need to be forward thinking, and how do you bring those other technologies in place that maybe are more proactive, right, and minimize that future risk that hasn't occurred yet, right? Those are harder to sell, right? When something hasn't occurred, or it's harder for them to grasp their hands around of the cost value, right?
Mm-hmm.
The cost to risk
Right.
value there. Those are harder, right? I mean, to do for sure. I think ransomware and those kind of things are getting easier because they understand, they see it, they hear about it all the time, right? Everybody's on the news, lots of articles in whatever industry that you're in
Mm-hmm.
is impacted. And I think those, if you could show we're minimizing our risk to ransomware by doing these things, those are a little easier. We've talked about in the past, I think it's security, you could become very paralyzed as an organization because of all the different directions you could go with from a security perspective. I like to take the step back, or found it to be more successful, of building kind of that security maturity scorecard, something that's simple, right? You start with the
Yeah, talk
basics,
about
right?
that if you don't mind. You and I had talked about this in the past. You showed me an example of it. So how does that? So what do you call it again? A security
Security
maturity?
maturity scorecard.
Yeah. So explain that concept.
Sure. So a lot of, and this again varies on organizations, but I think it's pertinent to any size, in in having the conversation, because if you're a smaller organization, you might not even know where to begin. Right. And you're getting bombarded by a lot of different angles of, you need to do this, you need to do that. I'm talking, lots of different security vendors are calling you up, and saying what you should do. But you don't even know where to start. So you become paralyzed, and then you make no movement forward, right? Because you don't know where to begin. So, I have found, oh, go ahead.
No, well, and that's to me seems to be one of the bigger challenges, right? Because the landscape, as we've discussed, is just there's so many vectors. There's so much coming at everybody, right?
Yeah, and I think if you're a large organization, you have the small organization has the same threats, same concerns, maybe the same kind of data, maybe even more sensitive, right? Sometimes than larger organizations, but they don't have the resources sometimes readily available to them as a larger organization. But I've seen large organizations become just as paralyzed because of so much complexity, and all the different groups that need to be involved in the conversations, and it becomes, again, cloudy and very difficult to take on. So what I've found to be successful is building kind of a red, yellow, green scorecard. And it's not, the in-depth, NIST framework document, right, which is part of it, right, that you got to do. But it's more of that higher level of, here's the best practices from a security, and it covers people, process, and tech, right? So it's everything you think about. You might say endpoint protection, or you might say, do you have policies in place, or do you have MFA, right? Do you have those things? And, do you have backups in place? Do you have, data loss prevention? And then you start going up the maturity list, right? Do you have, data loss prevention tools, right? There's various maturities. So if you start out with this scorecard, and it might not look great, right, when you walk into an organization that hasn't pulled everything together, or you might quickly learn really quick of each of you kind of then you start filling in the tech piece, you layer in the tech piece of each of those things that what you might be doing, or maybe under the people piece, it might be training, like their security training. Are you doing, a know before, or some other product, or even doing just education, right, to your staff. And you could start layering in those pieces, and you could quickly see, this was the intent of this when I first created it, was for that board level, right? When you're going to the board and they want to know, what is your security posture? At the end of the day, they're kind of like, are we secure, and what are you doing to make us secure?
And it can be I think the way you showed it to me, it was kind of a PowerPoint slide, right? And it wasn't any more complicated than that. It was
Correct.
Like a single, okay.
Correct. Right. Yeah, it was a one-pager, with those topics, those high-level topics, and then what were you doing as an organization? And it's semi-subjective, right? Because, are you red, or are you yellow, or are you green? There could be some hard, fast things you've implemented, right? And maybe that's a green or something, right? But there could be some subjective things when you start getting into, education and policies and things like that you might have, or what level of it you're doing. So you may grade yourself, still a yellow, even though you might be further along than other organizations in those things, right? So, but it's making that one pager so it's palatable, right? You could take this to a CEO, you could take this to the CFO, you could take it to users, in your group, and kind of see, hey, this is where we stand. And then it allows you to be more targetable, right? It's a lot easier to have that conversation than based on your organization of weighing that risk versus cost, right? Because again, that varies based on your industry and who you are and what you're doing. And, do you need data loss prevention? Maybe there's some organizations that don't worry about that based on the type of work that they do and the data and stuff, right? But it might be more important, to others. But it allows you to be also communicate your building blocks better, right? Because there's certain security things that I consider like bricks and mortar, right? Endpoint of protection, of course, right? Backups, patching, those things, and they could see then what you're doing, right? And how you're, what you're doing about it. But it creates a map also for IT, right? So the map can start building off, here's the projects we're going to start targeting. It creates that picture for it's a lot easier to go in and say, here's where we're at, and have it opens the dialogue and conversation to be less technical sometimes as well, with those different levels of leadership, I guess.
Okay. So how specific, or do you have a different scorecard for your plus ones that report to you versus the people you report to, for example?
So the scorecard itself is utilized at all levels. Then when we turn it into projects, the project
Okay.
detail, of course, might pull out then and be in more detail for the, for what I'm sharing with my directors, right? In
Okay.
the IT space. So we might say if we're implementing, let's say we need to implement a, a SOC SIM solution, right? We don't have, we
Hmm.
don't have this higher level monitoring, right? And advanced, alerting and reaction, response system. Like that would then turn into a project for whoever's responsible, for that area, and then it would feed up to the greater scorecard, right? Once we address those things, or you go live with something, then you could change that on the scorecard, and that scorecard is readily available to.
Well, but something like that could impact 6 or 7 things on the scorecard,
Correct.
right?
You're
SOC
right.
SIM
You're
could
right.
be a DLP. It could be your firewall.
And even bigger than that, for small to like medium businesses that leverage a lot of managed service partners, it's a lot easier diagram and take right to those conversations of, oh, this managed service provider, they offer endpoint protection, they offer phishing software, they offer a SOC, right? They provide backup software, so you can check off those things, potentially, with it just helps that visualization, right? Like it really does.
So does it help with the cost benefit analysis as well? Or is it just more of a higher level? This is what we need, and this is where we need to focus.
It doesn't help with getting into the true cost analysis piece of it with that scorecard. What I think it does is, as I said, it opens up the dialogue to say, are you doing it? Should we be doing it? Right? Is it something we have to look at? And then it starts that conversation, right? Is that then cost effective for us to do, right? From a leadership level, if I'm sitting in with, board members and I show, oh, we're red on data loss prevention, they might not even know what that means, right? At that level right away. But then it opens a dialogue of, well, why are we red on data loss prevention? And then you could start having that dialogue of, this is what that means in our scenario, this is what it does and what it protects. And then you could get some direction on, is it important, to you as an organization? And then those drive into that cost analysis, deep dive if it becomes a project at that point in time.
Okay. So, and I know we're kind of going deep on the scorecard thing, but it sounds to me like a fairly useful tool. I mean, is this something that your peers do on a regular basis? Is this a fairly common thing?
Yeah, so I created this. Yeah, so I originally created it back having conversation from a previous company when I had to go to the board and kind of show our security posture. So it started from there. It transformed into the managed services world. I was the CIO of a local managed services company where we were now responsible for, 70 plus organizations. And how do you show them? And again, you're having level conversations with maybe the CEO, maybe an IT director, maybe the CFO, right? On those small to medium businesses, the way they're structured, those were the ones that I think it became more valuable for, because they're the ones that just had no idea where to begin and how do they start this process. And this was a tool to allow them, to give them visibility, feel like they're in control, a little bit, right? Of what path they take. It started to become clearer of what these different things even mean, right? Because it put them on one page in I'd say common language, not tech speak, right? With it, it kind of showed what it actual was resolving, like what's the risk, right? When I put this in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's evolved. Peers, I would say, there's probably different flavors of this, right? That are out there. I haven't come across this particular format in this way, broken down, this simplified, and I've shared it, and I've spoken at other things with nonprofits here in Columbus, right? I had the opportunity to do that, and they were the same kind of way, right? Being a nonprofit, where do they begin, right? They have, the funds are not as deep, as as a lot of other organizations,
Mm-hmm.
but yet they still have sensitive data, right? They still may be answering to customers, right? As well, and making sure that they're assured that they're protecting their information. So I haven't seen anything quite like it. The same way, I think the big thing is you see a big jump. I think you see the big jump to getting to that very complex, gap analysis documents against a framework or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
off, a formal vulnerability and risk assessment that may have been done on your organization, you jump to that. And I think that's a piece that's called out as a bucket, with even in my maturity scorecard, right, of are you doing third-party risk assessments, right? It's called out at that
Mm-hmm.
level because that's what the board, that's what I'm showing. Because if you're not doing it, you're red, right?
Right.
But if you are, you're green. But then that deeper dive into the stuff is more held in that area, right? That's resolving, and it's a separate project and stuff. So I see a need to have that higher dashboard, which I don't, I think some people are doing it, of course, but I think those are ones that they start getting paralyzed because they want to show too much and they start getting too techy, right? Into the weeds, and then you lose your leadership because they don't understand it, right? And they're, that you start losing them at that point in time versus really simplify, that simplification thing.
I think that's one of the keys to effective cybersecurity is simplification, right? Because it is just such a complex problem. So, as a CIO of a mid-sized organization without a ton of resources or, a consultant network or peer network, how do you populate your very first one of these things?
I think the beauty of this, right, is you start with a framework template that just has those high level categories, right? So as I said, it goes everything from endpoint protection, backups, like it's not the tech, right?
So,
It's
I guess my question is, how do you even know what category to start with? How do you even know to start with endpoint? How do you even know to include it? Right. I mean, can you use the NIST framework, for example, as your starting point, or the MITRE kill chain thing?
Yeah,
Is that
so
a
some of this,
possibility?
the way I created it, of course, came from a combination of experience and being in doing a lot of the frameworks and things like that. And, I think as an organization to start with the basics though. So if I was walking into an organization and a jumping off point might be, we need cyber liability insurance. And maybe that's not a jumping off point for some companies because that might be an item that you have to get, right? As part of your maturity. But as I said, with that, they give you criteria, right? So there's some basic criteria that you need to have, right?
Okay.
So do you have password policies? Do you have MFA? Do you have good backups? So you could start to build those categories, what makes sense to you, even if it's a little less than what I have on my defined template today, right? And that's kind of really how it started, right? It really started of, hey, do we have, as I said, there's what I consider bricks and mortar type things, right? So that are easy to talk about, right? Antivirus software on your computer, right? I think that's an easy one to say. Do you have it or don't you have it? Do you have backups, right? Again, it starts at that level. And then you start getting into the weeds of, well, I don't know. Do we have good backups, right? What are we doing? So at the starting point, you don't have to put in the specific tech, right? At the starting point, as I said, you're putting basic categories. And I think you could ramble off, regardless of your level, you could probably ramble off a few that you might think about, right? If you have a good starting template,
Sure.
better, right? But if you don't, I think there's those, are you patching things? Do I run patches, right? It doesn't get into yet in that conversation, well, how do I do patches, right? It's just, do I do patches, right? So
Right.
you have those categories and at that broad stroke, right? So that at least starts painting the picture of, here's the things that I need to start asking about, right? And that might be your CIO creates this sheet, or it might even be, some other leadership, CFO might start, COO might start asking these questions. Do we have backups? What are we doing for antivirus? Like, what do we, so together you could kind of develop this base template, it may vary in your organization. And then you start layering in the tech. Your IT, if you're fortunate and you have some internal IT folks, right, they could start answering some of the specifics of, we use XYZ vendor, right, for this, right? We have this firewall, right? We have web content filtering enabled. Yes, right. We use this tech, for it. So they start filling that in. If you have service providers, you start disseminating that list with your service providers and say, okay, my managed services partner, what are you using, for this, right? And then you start filling in the data. So it could take a little time, right? But depending on how complex and depending on what your IT resources look like and how many
Right.
partners you
Maturity
use.
level. Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that all comes into play of gathering the information. But then you start off red with everything, right? Unless you can answer it. Then you start flipping them, right? So it's okay to start off red because you don't know what you don't know. And until you could give a valid answer, it's red, right? Unless you could explain it and you know what it is, it should be red, right? On there. So you could start off red, and then you start going through answering those, those things.
And one question begets another, begets another, begets another,
Yep.
right? Which is often usually the case.
Correct. And a lot of them are tied together, right? And might be one product answers 4 or 5 of them, right? That you have. But what I have found is, as I said, it kind of adds transparency. It starts the conversation. Yeah, as I said, it helps with that, getting beyond that paralyzation aspect. I have found, at least, in my experience.
Okay, well, Brian, thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe. We post new episodes every week. If you'd like to join our mailing list, become a guest, or suggest topics for future episodes, you can find us on LinkedIn, on our landing page at anchor.fm/InsideDT, or at InsideDT.net. Talk to you soon.